Yeah, so Dr. Barnum's going to review the 2018 Police Department traffic stop data, and I think the chief is going to introduce. Chief, you going to come up?
Good evening, Jody Matherly, Police Chief. As you know, every year for the past several years, we've critiqued ourselves and measured ourselves and looked at data and trends on how we're doing with disproportionality and minority contact. And as it's been said before, you know, we're a big critic of ourselves, and we like that. We like to make sure that we're doing what's expected with good policing practices and what the community expects. And Dr. Barnum from St. Ambrose has been a critical piece of that. The upside from having him here year after year is he knows our city, our system, and so there's consistency in how this is done, and that's key for us. It's not different every year. He sat down a few weeks ago and walked through some of the preliminary findings, so he's ready to present those tonight. And I will let you know that with the help of Captain Brotherton and Captain Campbell and the rest of the police department, we continue to work on bias-based policing. We're in the middle of training for that right now as we speak, as a matter of fact. And look at other ways that we can reduce disproportionality, and I think we're making progress. So I just met with some folks from the school today when we talk about the high amount of suspensions for black females in the school systems, not just in Iowa City but nationwide. And you know, my comment was, you know, things can be fixed. This is not beyond our control. It takes good leadership, but it takes good training, good direction, and a change of culture in how we do things, and I think we're achieving that at the police department. So with that, I'll let Dr. Barnum have the floor unless there's any questions, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. So, Dr. Barnum, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to end your presentation and our discussion by 5:45. Do you think that's reasonable target?
Yeah, I think that's certainly reasonable.
Okay, that's what we're shooting for, folks.
So thank you for having me here tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chief. One thing before I get started, I've had some computer issues, so when I get to the slides on individual disproportionality, the slide on my screen is incorrect, and I've been working all day trying to fix it. So I'll go to the Word document which I sent to you all, which is correct. It's just for some reason on my PowerPoint, I don't know what's going on there. So just a heads up as we get going. So again, this is as the Chief said, this is the this is like almost 10 years now we've been doing the data here, and so we have a pretty good run going. We're able to look longitudinally at the data, so we have a feel for which direction everything's heading and so forth. So I'll just run you through kind of what we do real briefly, the background, and then we'll get into the findings here. So when Iowa City reports a stop, the stops come up in terms of different 1 mile square grids that the city's been mapped out at. And so when I receive the data, the stop, where the stop occurred, I can tell where it happened according to which grid it was in. So what we essentially do then is we go into these different areas, particularly the areas where a lot of stops are made, and we watch traffic essentially to see the racial proportions of the drivers on the roads. So, and we've been doing that since 2007, so I guess it's 12 years now. And we've made so far, which I'll show you in a second, over 100,000 observations, and I'll show you where we mainly look and the reasons why. And that establishes our benchmark that we then compare the police data to. So that's kind of what we do. We get the data from the police department, and then we compare it to our benchmarks, and we look to see if there's any difference between those. So these are the number of stops by those different zones. So you can see most of the stops are made in a particular zone, and that happens to be zone 21, which is the downtown area. So it's right here. So of the over 12,000 stops made by the police department, the vast majority of those were made in the downtown area. And then there was quite a few made in Zone 29, which is the Broadway Cross Park area, and then the surrounding zones around that. Zone 13 is just north of downtown on Dubuque Street there. So you can see where the stops are made. And those are the areas we like to really watch traffic in to establish our benchmarks, because that's where all the stopping's occurring at. So this kind of lays it out for you where the stops are being made on the map. So the area in red is where the stops are most frequently made, and then in yellow are the areas where the stops are still higher than the rest of the town, but not as high as the downtown area. And this breaks out the number of stops by the police department, breaking it out by day or night. For us, a day is from 7 a.m. to 7 at night, and the opposite is nights. That's how we split the data in terms of days and nights. And it's not really an issue, but it kind of matters for our benchmarks, whether it's dark or light out. So this slide breaks out the total number of observations we've made since 2007. You can see we're up over 110,000 now. And these are the areas we really concentrate on looking at when usually it's usually grad students come up here and watch traffic. And we tend to do that. We just finished a year of doing that. They were up here not every day of the year, but over the course of the year, we hit every day of the week. We hit pretty much every hour of the day. We hit football weekends and so on and so forth. So we have a pretty good feel for what the benchmarks are in those areas. So specifically, these are the zones that get watched heavily, and that just corresponds to the map. These are the benchmark values that we have established, and those are really simple. We just simply aggregate. So the people who are watching the traffic, they mark white male, black male, white female, so on and so forth, and then we just count them. And we aggregate them across different observers. We use some techniques to check validity. The validity is generally pretty good, which means that one person's seeing pretty much the same thing as everybody else, which we like to see. And you can see there's a little bit of difference in the benchmarks between day and night in some of the zones, but not in all of them. Now, in areas where we don't watch heavily, we just use a standard 0.1, or 10% of the drivers are minority drivers in those areas. And that's based on census figures. But there's not very many stops made in those areas. It wouldn't be very cost efficient to really watch areas where there's few stops made, because well, you guys actually have to pay our grad students for coming up here and looking at the traffic. So that's why we do that. So just so it's clear, this 0.10 number means that what we saw in Zone 13 was 10% of the drivers on the roads were minority drivers in that area. And then the rest of it corresponds on the way down there. I always give this caveat, so keep in mind with the benchmarks, they're not absolute. They're a sample of the traffic on the roads, and like any sample, there's sampling error. It's impossible to estimate the amount of error because we don't know the sample size. It's infinite. So I don't know how large the area is. I can guess, based on what we see from year to year, that our benchmarks are probably within 3 percentage points either direction, because we tend to see the same things, but I probably can't guarantee that. So here's the data from 2018. And this is just from the entire department, which looks just like what I showed you in the earlier slide. This just shows where the stops are being made. Again, Zone 21, 29, 13, those areas that I showed you on the map are where all the stops are being made by the police department in general. Now, this next slide is actually what you want to see. And this is the slide that compares the percentage of police stops to our benchmarks. So the percentage of police stops are the blue lines, and our benchmarks are the red lines. And graphs like these are a little bit deceiving because in areas where it looks like there's a whole lot of difference, which we call disproportionality. For example, here in Zone 19, you can see that the percentage of police stops is a lot higher than our benchmark. But if you go back to this and you look at 19 right here, you can see that there's very few stops made there. So although there's disproportionality there, it's based on a small number of stops. So what we really like to look at are the areas where there's lots and lots of stops being made. And if we find disproportionality there, that's more of a problem. So Zone 21 is where there's a lot of stops being made. And that's these two bars right here. And you can see there's a little bit of disproportionality, but not nearly to the extent as what we saw in Zone 19. So what we do to try to make this a little bit more interpretable is we simply calculate a weighted average across each of the zones. So we compare the difference between the police stops and the benchmark, and then weight it by the number of stops made there. And that's where we get that number. So what that means, this value of 0.07, is that on average, the percentage points, the percentage of police stops was 7 percentage points higher than our benchmarks, weighted by the number of stops across all the zones. Y'all with me? Okay. And then we split it out by days and nights. So here's the pattern of stops for days, which are very similar to the department as a whole, and nights will be similar as well. And here's the level of disproportionality. On days, it's a little bit lower than it is for the department as a whole. I would say in Zone 28, there's a fair amount of disproportionality and a fair amount of stopping there. So that might be an area that they might want to look at a little more closely. And then for nights, the pattern again is the same. Most of the stops are made downtown. And the level of disproportionality is 9 percentage points higher than our benchmark, so that's higher than the average. Days are pulling the average down for the whole department, and nights are pulling it up. So on night, there's a little bit more disproportionality than there is during the day, is what the bottom line on these data are. Is there any comments or questions on this so far? Okay. So now we're getting into the officer level analysis. So the first slide I'm going to show you is correct. The second slide I'm going to go to a Word doc to show you so I can compare it because there's a problem with this. So this is just the formula of how we actually compute this index. We compare, for each officer, we compare the percentage of minority stops to the benchmarks and divide that by the percentage of non-minority drivers over that benchmark, and that equals a number. So any number essentially bigger than 1 means some sort of disproportionality, so that's what we look for. A number 1 would be you're equally likely, given the benchmarks, to stop a minority versus a non-minority driver. So numbers larger than 1 are what we look for. So here's the slide. So these are the values along here of that index, which I was talking about. This blue dashed line here is sort of what we consider a bare minimum for analyzing an officer, and that's 100 stops. If they're not above 100 stops, then sometimes the numbers can get kind of messed up because the number of it can be noise in the data that are, the law of large numbers isn't in effect if you don't have at least 100 stops. So you might be seeing what you think is disparity or disproportionality, but it's really just noise. So the more stops, the better, and kind of the benchmark that we use pretty much everywhere we go is 100. We'd like to see 100 stops before we start really analyzing the officer's data. So anybody above the line we'll look at. So this is the number of stops on the y-axis over here. So you can see this officer right there made over 1,000 stops. And then this line right here, this lightly dashed line is the 90th percentile, and this heavily dashed line is the median for the department. So the median in 2018 was under 2. It was between 1 and 2. I think it's probably, just looking at that, probably around 1.7, which is lower than it has been.
Chris, I'm looking at the material we got in our handout. So the chart that's similar to this one is called Figure 8, Officer Index Values 2018.
Yeah, let me get.
And it, what you have on the screen is very similar, but it's not identical.
Yeah, that's what I was worried about.
Yeah,
Let me just pull up that for
the
right here.
scale differs, and actually some of the individual officers' blue dots are different.
Yeah, I'll just pull it up and we'll look at that one. I don't trust, I trust this one. Like I said, I could not transfer that graph to the PowerPoint for some reason. Okay, so these are the two charts I want to look at. So this is the one I was just showing you right here. And so this is the 2018 data.
I don't know, we're not seeing anything.
Oh, you guys don't see it?
We just see the graphic you initially showed us.
Now I'm getting, please wait while it logs in. Sorry.
I think
It's
what's up
loading.
here now is the same as what's in the late handouts.
In the late handout?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't have a chance to go through the late handout, so I'm looking at what we got initially.
Mayor, so one of the charts was a little off for comparison, so we updated it and we sent it out Monday.
Okay, so this one is, that's up there right now, is accurate,
Updated, so you might have the old one.
and this is
It's in
for,
the late
This one.
and
So
this is,
so the old one, the scales were different, so I just made the scales identical. And when I did that, for some reason, the PowerPoint wouldn't take it. So can you see it now on your screens?
Yeah, it's on our screens.
yeah, I see what you initially put up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. So this is correct data here. These are correct. So so I guess the way to look at this and then is to compare it to the year before. And this was the one I couldn't bring up on the data, this chart. So you can see here, as we go back and forth, we have an officer that was above the 100 mark threshold, the 100 stop mark threshold, and had a relatively high disparity index there, over 4, up around 5. And in the 2018 data, that isn't the case anymore. So that's no longer a problem. One other thing you'll notice is that the median has gone down in 2018 as compared to 2017, which is good. That's progress. These officers here are showing a lot of disproportionality. I'm looking at 2018, but they're not at 100 stops. So although they count in calculating the median in the 90th percentile, some of that could be due to noise in conjunction with considering that the benchmark's a sample too. So the more stops, the better when you're looking at this thing.
Dr. Barnum, we can't see the mouse when you're
Oh, I'm sorry. So, well,
you're looking at, just if you can describe what you're looking at, that would help.
You can't tell where I'm pointing either. So it's the 5 dots
Yeah.
below the blue line, but right by the
On
4
the right
there.
side.
Got the laser on the way.
Figure out how to use it.
On the way.
Lazed myself.
Just don't,
There we go.
Don't aim
Those are
at
the guys
Jody.
I was talking about. Yeah, don't. I'd also like to show you another graph, which is in the PowerPoint, which is correct, which is from 2016 too. So I'll go to that unless you have some questions on this. If I can get it to come up. I don't think it came up, did it?
No, we don't see it.
Try again. It's thinking.
Maybe it's actually meditating.
It might be meditating. Mindfulness. So I'm going to, because it's not coming up, I'm going to try to reopen it. See if we can do it that way. It's still not coming up.
So it's just frozen, I guess.
Let me exit this one. So I can see it on my screen, but it's not coming up on that screen.
Take a look and see if there's something.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Trade different.
There you go. Got something different.
Okay, we're doing. This one? There.
Yeah, I
You
keep
should be
going.
able to move,
Okay.
move through us.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is from 2016, and
17.
no, this is 16 now.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, this is 16 now. So this is not in your handouts. This is the year before that. And let's see if I can figure this out again. So this dot right here is now up around 6. It was like at 5 in 17, and that's the same officer. So one good thing about that is that's not an issue in the 2018 data. And again, the median has gone down since 16. So that looks like progress. Any questions?
What's the median now,
It's,
or for 2018?
yeah, I'll show you. So it's
Oh, I see.
there compared to,
Yeah, so it's like 1.8 versus
yeah,
1.95 or something
yeah,
like that. Huh?
Something like that.
Good.
So that's moving in the right direction. So then the other part that we always look at are stop outcomes, and stop outcomes are citations, arrests, searches, essentially. We look at if there's disparity in those, and for these we don't need a benchmark. We can just look at the data and we can compare how drivers are treated once they're stopped each other. It's a lot more straightforward. You don't have to worry about the benchmarks and so forth. We compute an odds ratio to do this, which is simply a comparison of two odds. It gives you an idea of effect size and the difference between how one group is treated in comparison to the other. And so here's the raw data, and then the odd ratio. Oops, sorry about that. The odd ratio is, it says simple odd ratio right there. So that's 1, essentially, which is good, because the number 1 means that the odds are equally likely that after a traffic stop occurs, a minority driver will receive a citation as compared to a non-minority driver. And that's been pretty stable the last couple of years, and so that's a good thing. So there's no really difference in terms of who gets a ticket once they're stopped in Iowa City. So this is a summary of arrests, and in this slide, all arrests are grouped together. I'm going to break it out here in a minute. But when an arrest is made on a traffic stop, the odds are twice as likely that a black driver will be arrested in comparison to a white driver, or a minority compared to a non-minority. And so, sort of a way to look at that is that the minority drivers are twice as likely to get arrested as a non-minority driver on a traffic stop. But as you're going to see, it's a little more complicated when you think about it, because some stops are discretionary in nature, which means the officer has a choice whether or not to make the arrest. And other stops or arrests are non-discretionary, so the officer doesn't really have a choice on those. So we compare those. And so what we hope to see in terms of good numbers are for discretionary stops, the ones where the officers have a choice, the number is lower than for non-discretionary stops. And it is. So for discretionary stops, that number is 1.3 instead of 1.9. So it's much closer to 1 than it was before. Now you can see there's not that many of them. There's only 74 of those that occurred. And out of 712 arrests that were made on traffic stops, 74 of those were non-discretionary. But when they did occur, there really wasn't much disproportionality between minority and non-minority drivers being stopped. And then this last slide is the non-discretionary arrests, and this is where the officer really doesn't have much of a choice. They pretty much, it's like a warrant. They pretty much have to make an arrest. And we see disparity there. The odds ratio's up over 2. But again, you can't really call that bias, because the officer has stopped the car. Maybe there's a warrant on the driver. Maybe the driver's under suspension. The officer doesn't really have a choice, and the numbers are showing up the way they are because that's differential in offending there. That's what that is showing. Any questions on that?
What would be there's still the reason why the stop, right?
Right. So and that's the first part, right? So that's why that's why we have to divide it out. We look to see if there's disparity. Are blacks getting stopped more than whites? And we saw for the department about 7 percentage points higher than the benchmarks. Mm-hmm. But once the stop occurs, then the officer has a lot of choices how that stop's going to turn out. And when the officer has a great deal of choice, we find much lower levels of disproportionality than when the officer doesn't have a choice for arrests.
Chris, what's an example of a non-discretionary arrest and a discretionary arrest? Can you give examples of both?
Yeah, so a good example of a non-discretionary arrest would be a warrant, right? You stop a car, you go up to the driver, you get the driver's license, you run a warrant check, and this person has a warrant. That's essentially an order from a judge telling the officer to go ahead and make an arrest. A non-discretionary arrest might be a situation where the officer has some judgment. For example, if the officer's looking at perhaps whether or not, I'm trying to think of a good example here of non-discretionary, because they don't happen all that often. So it would be maybe, so the driver is creating a loud disturbance, let's say, and gets arrested for disturbing the peace or something like that. The officer doesn't have to make an arrest there, but the officer decides to make an arrest. So those would be an example of discretionary arrests, where the officer has a choice. OWIs, driving while barred, those types of things, the officer really doesn't have much of a choice. You can't really let a drunk driver go. I mean, you could, but you shouldn't do that. So they don't do that. And warrants, you can't do that. Driving while barred, you can't just turn a blind eye to that. So you pretty much have to make an arrest in those situations. I hope that cleared it up.
Yeah, thanks.
So we also track consent searches, but the Iowa City Police Department doesn't make consent searches since the last 2 years, and last year they only made one in 2018. So a consent search is when they don't have probable cause to search a car, and so they ask the driver, can we search your car? There were some issues. I think officers were filling out their forms incorrectly, when saying they were consent searches when they really weren't, when they were probable cause searches. And so once we talked with the officers at length about what the differences were and how they should fill out the forms, and pretty much the police department doesn't make those, so we can't analyze those data anymore. What we have started, though, is probable cause searches. So probable cause search would be if you go up to a car and say you smell marijuana in the car, which gives you probable cause to search. If you're sure it's marijuana, you have probable cause at that point, and you can search the inside of the car. And we do find some disparity there. The odds ratio for that is 2.45. And what we track in conjunction with that is the hit rates. And what I mean by that is when those types of searches occur, do you find anything? Do you find evidence? Do you find contraband? And so we track it. So we track to see so we see there's disproportionality in the probable cause search. Minority drivers are 2.5 times more likely to have a probable cause search conducted on their car. And now this next slide shows the hit rates, and actually when probable cause searches occur, this number is below 1, so you have to take the reciprocal of it, which means that when those searches occur, the officers actually find contraband or evidence from the white drivers of a probable cause search twice as often as they do from the black drivers. So even though the probable cause searching, a black driver is more likely to be searched based on probable cause, hit rates are higher for white drivers than black drivers. So that's something to keep an eye on as we go forward. And this final slide shows you some of the outcomes over time. So you can see for citations, for example, that number since 2015 has hovered around 1, which is good. Arrests is around 2, but keep in mind that those are mainly non-discretionary. This search category here is for voluntary searches. And those numbers were traditionally around 2. The last 2 years, we haven't been able to track those. And then the hit rates you can see. So what we found, and this is consistent with this year's finding, is that there are not higher hit rates for minority drivers than white drivers, than non-minority drivers. And then I have a couple of summary slides, but I just pretty much summarized it for you. So I'll entertain your questions.
Great, thanks. So do any of you have questions for Dr. Barnum?
I know it's extremely hard to, not a lot of other communities do this, right? It's only Davenport, is that correct?
So we've done Davenport, the city of Dubuque. We have done Ames and the Iowa State Police Department.
Okay. And is it possible, I know each community is of course different, but how are we comparing in terms of the other communities in terms of disproportionality? And a lot of times we look at that, the top 10 metro areas and in other factors. Roughly how do we compare with those other communities?
So do you mean in the stops or the outcomes?
Both.
Both. Dubuque had a very low level of disproportionality. In fact, they were almost at 0 levels of disproportionality. Davenport traditionally has around 9 percentage points above our benchmarks, and I haven't presented Ames yet, so I'm not at liberty to say theirs. So you're a little better in Davenport, but you're not as good as Dubuque, if you want to use the vernacular.
And to follow up on that, were you able to gather any information from Dubuque as to how they were able to achieve that, or was that sort of beyond the scope of the study? You're primarily looking at the data, because that's spectacular. It's great work with Dubuque. We've had positive trend lines, but were you able to gather that, because it seems to me that just wouldn't happen. That would be the result of a targeted activity on the part of the city of Dubuque.
So it was interesting up there because the officers, I'm pretty sure the officers didn't know know. We look backwards at their data. They didn't know during the study period that they were being examined. So I'm not sure what's being done up there. I will say this, that there's a lower level of, there's a lower percentage of minority drivers on the road in Dubuque. That might play into it. The city's different in terms of its dynamics of where the stops occur and so forth. There's more stops made away from the city center in Dubuque than there is here. So it's a little bit
Apples to oranges.
yeah, it really is. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. One would be, we have these areas, the city's broken down into these squares. Within those areas, do you map which corridors or which streets the stops are made?
No, we don't get that information. So what I receive from the police department is I don't get an address where, I don't get a ladder lawn or an address where the stop occurred. I just get observation zone 32 or whatever. But what we do is within those zones, we watch a lot of different intersections when we're watching traffic. But I don't know exactly where within that mile the stops are being made. No.
Would it be difficult to obtain that information?
I think it's difficult for the police to get that. I think the way they're set up now, and in fact, I know that's the case because prior to the 1 mile square units, we didn't have anything. We just had the beat where it occurred, which is a huge area. And so they went to a lot of effort to get this. Ideally, what we'd like to see is a latitude and longitude of the stop, and then, or UTM coordinate is another thing, and then we can actually compare that to census data directly and so on and so forth. That's done in some other communities, but it's based on the system you have in place a lot, and so to change that would probably be a major and costly undertaking.
Okay. And then the other question I had is, have you done any studies in cities which employ traffic cameras?
Davenport does.
And what, if any, effect that has on disproportional stops?
So what we've wanted to do, and I haven't been able to do yet, is look at the actual stops from the traffic cameras and compare it to what we find. We haven't done that yet, so I don't know what effect that has, but that would be a very interesting question.
So there's 7% higher the benchmark for minorities when they're stopped?
Across the city, yes.
Across the city. Do you know, give us some examples of reasons why they were stopped?
Yeah. So we do have that information. I didn't present it. We can track whether it was for like an equipment violation or a moving violation. What's not presented in here are, say, calls for service. So these are all officer-initiated stops where the officer makes a decision to stop the car. When I do look at the data that way, minorities tend to be stopped in higher numbers for equipment violations, and whites tend to be stopped more for moving violations.
So back tail light out, or?
Yeah, or maybe even a license plate light out if you're getting really down to brass tacks.
Okay. Have you done any communities where within the state marijuana is legal?
No.
Okay.
I'm curious about crime trends. Have you been able to do any analysis or look at least more a broader cross-section in terms of as communities have less disproportionate minority contact, we see positive crime trend reductions? Can you make that case?
So what's interesting is Davenport. We've been doing Davenport since the beginning, 2005. And Davenport has, I don't know if you follow the news in Davenport very closely, but they have a pretty substantial problem with neighborhood shootings in Davenport, particularly right around St. Ambrose, actually, just south of the campus. And we find a police response to the shootings increases disproportionality, okay? What we haven't found, though, is whether that police response lowers the number of shootings. So that's a very interesting question, which we really are looking at. And that's something that actually should be talked about at a community level. So what do you want the police to do? They have a lot of shootings, say, on Gaines Street in Davenport, Gaines and, say, 17th Street. And if you live in that neighborhood, you get pretty tired of your cars being shot up all the time. So, we want the police to do something. And so when the police go in there and they have special enforcement teams, which they call NETs, what happens is those NETs officers generally have very disparate numbers. And so in other words, minorities are being stopped at higher rates. But what we haven't been able to establish is whether that has any effect on the shootings or not. So it's the open question is, does a traffic stop lower shootings? I don't know.
I'd like to ask a couple questions that maybe Jody could answer better than you, Chris. But Jody, the first question I'd like to ask is whether the Community Police Relations Board members have been provided with a copy of Dr. Barnum's report and given a chance to interpret it from their perspective.
Not before you, Mayor. I want you guys to have it first.
Okay,
But
great.
certainly, it's always on our website. It's always available. And this is something that we can have put on the agenda now that he's presented the 2018 results to you folks, and talk to CPRB about that. Sure.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that would be of considerable interest to the board members. The other thing has to do with your own perspective. Basically, we see really good trends here in the data that Dr. Barnum's provided us, but they still show disproportionality in a worrisome way. So what's your thoughts about now, having been on the job for, 2.5 years or thereabouts, what are your thoughts now about how to improve the situation?
Yeah, so I stood here 2.5 years ago and told you folks that, there'd be some low-hanging fruit that we need to take care of right away, and that was the consent searches. I viewed it as a fishing expedition, and the stats showed that we weren't finding any more in a black driver's car than we were a white, so what are we doing? Why is it so disproportionate? Coupled with me telling them, quit just ripping cars apart because you're not finding anything, and they listened, as you can see. The courts have also started to rule that, dog searches and waiting for canines to arrive at a traffic stop, and this happened in Illinois too, and some at the federal level is now prohibited by law. So we can't just hold a motorist up and wait to do these dog sniffs and searches. So the courts have directed us, I've directed them, and so you've seen it kind of go to ground zero, which is a good thing. We're not holding motorists up, and you can see where the disproportionality started to dip there. Now we deal with the PC side of it. What's the probable cause? Okay, yeah, you can legally search it, but if there's disproportionality, which these are the first times we've measured those numbers, and so this is new to me too within the last few weeks. But that gives us something to sink our teeth into and know that that's a problem, and let's correct it and start dissecting why is that happening, what are the searches for, how do we build the probable cause, and take a look at that and address that as well. So this is just another piece of the puzzle to get things corrected. But overall, the way we've tried to change the culture in the police department, we're starting to see success, and I fully expect this to be a gradual change. This isn't going to go from a number 2 disparity down to the 1, which is our parity, which is our target. But it's trending down. So we had some successes last year with the outcomes and citations, and we continue in that mode. So I think we're good there. We get it. But the stops themselves, I was glad to see the extremes come down. We had a guy out in right field, and then we had him kind of center right, and now he's more towards center field, and that's where we need to keep pulling that back. But that moved the median back too. So as a group, we're improving, and I'd love to see those. That's what I expected to see. Jeff stood here last year and said, we're going to make progress, and we have. So I'm encouraged by those numbers. The officers are doing better. We did some distinct things like do monthly checks of this instead of waiting, because it was kind of like a surprise party for me. He would step up, and I'm like, how'd we do? And we shouldn't be surprised by these numbers. We need to manage our folks and supervise them properly. So each month we look at these numbers and say, hey, what do you got going on? Where are you patrolling? Are you patrolling? And this came right from his training when I came here, because a lot of our officers had not been trained by Dr. Barnum to say, here's probably some issues that you need to correct. are you patrolling your whole zone, or are you just going to one neighborhood and stopping cars where there's a high percentage of black drivers for a taillight out, and we need to improve in that area. So yes, and I don't even know what those numbers are, but if there's a higher number of defective equipments in one neighborhood, in general, what we tell them is knock it off. You're not finding anything there that's not good for business. You're not saving lives. You're not reducing violent crime. Patrol your whole zone. Go to those areas where there's hazardous violations and traffic crashes are occurring, where neighbors are complaining about speed, and do your traffic enforcement in those areas and make a difference. So we continue to do that. Mostly what I find, too, is the folks I have out in right field are my new officers. Big hearts, but they're full of energy, and they really... They have to be shown how to police smarter and better. The academies teach them the basics about bias-based policing, but they don't teach them the mechanics. That's up to us, and that's up to maturity and experience. Every one of our officers wants to do a good job. They want to please the community. They want to be fair. They want to be consistent. We train. We lead. They get feedback from community members all the time. We just have to show them how to do that. These numbers show they're responding, so I'm very pleased with that outcome. So we have more work to do, but we're going in the right direction, and I think these numbers show it.
Chief, marijuana has always been a huge source of disproportionality. What efforts, if any, has the department made related to marijuana enforcement specifically to get those numbers down?
So the pure volume of marijuana that we're taking in has been reduced 50-fold. I mean, we just don't take in weed like we used to because it's not a priority. Certainly, if you walk around, drive around with 30 pounds of weed and we come across it, we're going to deal with that. But I've been a proponent of making possession of marijuana a simple misdemeanor, maybe make it into a civil infraction, so we quit filling the jails with folks that have a joint on them, because 10 hours away you can smoke weed in Colorado, but yet we're lodging people in jail for it. But that's where we sit legally. So the officers, and I tell the community this, it's against the law. When we run across it, we'll deal with it. But the officers have been told to think outside the box. You have discretion, make good decisions out there. Police, enforce the laws, but do it fairly and consistently, and know that you have the latitude and the discretion to take care of business the way you see fit within our guidelines and within acceptable practices. And I think they're doing that. They're exercising better judgment. And we'd rather get the folks that are shooting guns in the neighborhoods and committing robberies and breaking into folks' homes and pick less on the joint in the ashtray. We'll deal with the joint in the ashtray, but we're not likely to put someone in jail as often these days. And I let the officers make that decision by leading them. We don't order them not to. They have discretion, but we're teaching them better. That's my take on it. When we run across it in a car, if you're driving around smoking weed, that's a problem.
Oh, that's different.
Studies are really clear that whether you're drunk or high or intoxicated, you can't operate while impaired, and I'll never condone that. So if you're going to smoke the weed, you better find a good spot to do it and don't operate a car. So those are some of the probable cause searches he talked about, and we have to deal with those when we come across it, just as we would a can of beer between somebody's legs while they're operating.
Very pleased with that.
Okay, y'all remember I said I was hopeful we would end this discussion by 5:45. Is there anybody else who really needs to ask a question?
I'll just make a quick comment. Having listened to this report now for, I'm not sure how many years we've sat here and had this every other year, but I'm just pleased to see the continued improvement. And I think we owe a lot to you, Jody, as well as Dr. Barnum, in terms of, having the data and your impact on the police force since you've been here. So glad to see it improving.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks to the officers. They're the ones doing the job.